The third annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is this Saturday. APTN National News is taking a look back at the past year since the Pope's apology. Potential unmarked graves continue to be found at residential school sites across the country, and various governments have committed to meeting reconciliation needs. Joining us now is Treaty Commissioner of Saskatchewan, Mary Musqua-Culbertson, for her views on reconciliation efforts. Well, Mary, thank you so much for joining us here today. My first question for you, in your opinion, what has changed for Indigenous people and especially residential school survivors since the Pope's apology last year?
I think that there's varied feelings since the Pope's apology. There was, of course, many people who were ecstatic. It was a part of closure for them. There was people who were indifferent, and people who were absolutely angry. If anything has changed, on a big scale, a larger scale that you can see, I don't think there has been a lot of change. I mean, he came here, he fulfilled a request to come and do apologies in person. The Catholic Church has repudiated the doctrine of discovery, but that does not mean that they have revoked it. He has said very left of center comments for an institution that is traditionally very right. But I mean, in terms of a change on the ground, there's no change. There's no change when you still have discoveries being made, when you still have the Catholic Church blocking access to records in any way they can, when you have denialism running rampant through this country every time there's a discovery.
Well, just on that note there, Mary, recently 93 unmarked graves were identified at the Beauval Indian Residential School site. And in response, you mentioned deniers often try to disprove this reality to show nothing was done wrong. What effect does this denial have on survivors?
Denying that these atrocities took place is basically denying all of the residential school system was a vehicle of assimilation. If we denied the Holocaust as Indigenous people and we're anti-Semitic, that's a criminal code violation. If we were actively displaying hate phrases, inciting hatred, committing hate crimes, those are criminal offenses. But society, people in society, governments even can do this to Indigenous people, and there is no recourse. We have no place to go. We can go to the UN and say, this has been happening, this has been happening, this has been happening. But where's the recourse for Canada? There is no sanctions. So it's the people on the ground who have to keep making those changes, regardless of what governments around us do, whether it's a provincial government, whether it's a federal government, whether it's a local government. It's the people on the ground who will keep making those steps going forward in reconciliation, and they will keep being the champions for change. And the denialism has, of course, it makes you angry. It's deplorable. And it's a way to discredit the voices of First Nations people again and again and again, to always call us liars, to say we're not telling the truth. You could tell them, you know, everything that they need to hear to prove something, but it is their choice to not believe it. And we have graves of infant-sized graves. You know, people need to be asking those questions of themselves. Why is there babies, infants buried outside of a Catholic cemetery where a residential school sat?
Yeah. And Mary, you've been also very vocal about your opposition to the Saskatchewan First Act that was introduced last November, an act that asserts exclusive provincial jurisdiction over natural resources in the province. How does this act fall in or out of line with reconciliation efforts?
Well, the act falling in or out of line for reconciliation efforts, I mean, it's two governments basically, you know, the provincial government asserting their jurisdiction which they believe is theirs, to the federal government. However, that jurisdiction that the federal government handed that provincial body when it was created after 1905, so after the treaties were entered into here, was an unlawful authority for theirs to give. So transferring of the NRTA, which was the creation of the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement, transfer of the delegated authority of those resources to Western Canadian provinces should not have been done. The federal crown at the time had no authority to do so. It was a complete breach of treaty. And by the Sask Act asserting that it's exclusive domain over resources, it's again taking it right back to that question of unlawful authority of the federal crown to grant the jurisdiction to over the resources. It's a complete breach of treaty. And there's no dialogue. It's a very hard line. And when you're making those assertions, and such as the Sask Trespass Act too, that has been it was being introduced a few years ago, and it's been widely promoted. And you have Saskatchewan's own citizens, many of them not agreeing, where they've created things like the Treaty Land Sharing Network, which is land title holders wanting to give access to Indigenous people on their land, whether it's for hunting, gathering, so they can practice their traditional ways, their inherent rights to feed themselves, to gather medicines. Whenever I drive by a ditch where you might see a lot of sage, I often think we're relegated to picking our medicines in the ditch now, because there's a no trespassing sign there.
Yeah. Well, Mary, we'll have to leave it there, but I wanted to say thank you, miigwech, to you for taking some time for us and speaking with us today.
Miigwech yourself. Thank you.